Deadly fighting pushes more Rohingya Muslims out of Myanmar. We look at how they've become known as one of the world's most vulnerable people. I'm Imran Garta, and today's newsmakers are the Rohingya. The Rohingyas' persecution is total. Their homes burned, women raped, men murdered, and children sent fleeing to the border. No one has stepped in to help them, not even as they cross the border into Bangladesh, which refuses to resettle the now 500,000 refugees trying to find safety. In the latest round of violence, Myanmar's military is accused of indiscriminately killing civilians as fighters from a group called the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army have attacked police and army outposts. Human rights groups say the Rohingya situation is one of the worst in the world. But why? How did nearly 2 million people find themselves without a country to call home? That debate in a moment, but first, this report by Natalie Perhernan.
For the Rohingya people, this is an all-too-familiar exodus, fleeing in their thousands from Myanmar to Bangladesh, a desperate march to safety.
Buddhists are killing us by bullets. They burn houses and try to shoot us. They kill my husband by bullet.
The Myanmar government are torturing us too much, and we could not tolerate the torture, so we have come here.
From this side of the border, those who have recently escaped can only watch as the fires continue to burn. This latest wave of violence began after the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army attacked police posts and an army base. The group says it's in response to the ongoing atrocities and killings committed by the government and the military. The same group claimed responsibility for an attack on border posts in October, leading to a full military response to track down the perpetrators. But it's ordinary Rohingya, like these men, women and children, who are paying the price. Like they've done many times before, as one of the world's most persecuted people. The area that is known as Rakhine used to be the Kingdom of Arakan. As early as the 9th century, Muslims are thought to have travelled there. But the origins of the Rohingya are disputed, because in 1824, during the British colonial period, Muslims were brought from Bengal to work. Many in the Rohingya community say their legacy begins before the colonial period, but the state and many Burmese say it doesn't. There's been ongoing conflict between the Rohingya and Burmese nationalists and the army for decades. But it's more recent history which has dramatically affected everyday life for the Rohingya. The 1982 citizenship law grants full citizenship to people who can trace their lineage in Myanmar prior to 1823, which excludes the Rohingya. It also restricts their rights to work, study, travel, practice their religion, and even to access healthcare. The Rohingya have faced discrimination, intercommunal violence and military crackdowns. In Myanmar, even their name is political. State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi describes them instead as Muslims or the Muslim community in Rakhine. A commission on Rakhine State led by former UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan reported that intercommunal conflict is leading to a real risk of radicalisation. And if the legitimate grievances of local populations are ignored, they will become more vulnerable to recruitment by extremists. But what can be done to stop the cycle of violence and persecution, which has scarred generations of Rohingya? Natalie Perhernan, The Newsmakers.
Let's get more on this with our panel. I'm joined now from Amsterdam by Clark Kjor. He's the chairman of the European Rohingya Council. And from New Delhi, Anaga Nilakantan. She's the Asia Program Director for the International Crisis Group. Thanks both of you for joining us. Anaga, let me begin with you first. A lot of people see these extraordinary images of these Rohingya Muslims crossing the border into Bangladesh, people on the move. They've not been hit by floods or a hurricane. This is not a natural disaster. Is it more of a political crisis?
Well, clearly, International Crisis Group, we've said for quite a long time that there are deep policy failures that have been made by successive governments in Myanmar over a very long period, and that they were creating conditions that could lead to really volatile situation. You see it now. This was not unpredictable. It was not unavoidable. There were clear signs, I think. There's a very long history, obviously, but the anti-Muslim violence and the violence in Rakhine State in general in 2012 and the emergence of this new militant group in October last year were pretty clear signs that time was running out. And despite that, there's been very little movement on the policy front to address the very complex dynamics in the state. So yeah, it is a political disaster.
And do you believe, Anaga, that Kofi Annan's plan has failed?
Well, it's just been issued. The Advisory Commission on Rakhine State, which Kofi Annan headed, issued its report, of course, the day these attacks happened, these awful attacks happened last week. But it does remain a pretty reasonable, realistic road plan, path forward. It's not going to make everyone happy, but this is a really complex situation that's going to need quite a lot of compromises on all sides. It's now, the onus is on the government, which has welcomed the report, to announce how it's going to start rolling out the implementations. Of course, before that can happen, the situation in Rakhine State needs to be stabilized.
Kyo, what's your message to the government of Myanmar?
Yes, our message to the government of Myanmar is to immediately stop army's atrocity crimes against Rohingya people, to immediately stop dehumanization of the Rohingya people across the country. This is to immediately stop misframing desperate Rohingya villagers as a terrorist, which is very, very dangerous. And this is what we want to send the message to the Burmese government, to immediately stop mass burning of Rohingya villages, indiscriminate shooting to the children and women. Yes.
Yeah, something I want to understand here. You say framing, desperate villagers as terrorists. So that's one thing, right? And there's an accusation of collective punishment, which seems to be taking place. On the other hand, this particular group, who were called Harakat al-Yaqin and now called Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, they have been actively attacking military and police outposts. They've been killing people. Do you separate them from the ordinary people? Do you condemn their tactics?
It is very important to know that they have already mentioned in their statement that they were surrounded by the security forces, and they had to defend themselves and the lives of their loved ones. And this situation was used as a justification to launch mass atrocities against Rohingya villages. And since last 2 weeks, the newly arrived army, have surrounded several villages in Arakan, in Maungdaw, Butidong, Ratidong area, and they have surrounded the villagers, and the villagers cannot go out to buy food and water. And finally, the villagers they became very, very desperate, and then they took what they have to attack, and the police forces. This is like a popular uprising, like in inmates in the prison, in Nazi concentration camps.
Okay. Let me ask you again, just to be absolutely clear, because you're saying popular uprising. This group has an Amir. I've got his name here, Amir Ataullah Abu Ammar Jununi. They have an Amir. They have certain theological and philosophical ideas which are very similar to some other jihadi groups, right? So they might be getting outside support. They are conducting attacks. What I'm saying is that I'm giving you the opportunity, and I'm asking you very clearly, do these people, this small group, have anything to do with the ordinary villagers who just want to go about their lives and who are being killed or being pushed out of their homes? Because I'm not absolutely sure what you're trying to tell me, whether these guys represent the people or whether they are separate from the people. So here's your opportunity to clarify.
Yes, actually, the ordinary children and women have nothing to do with this group, and this group has already mentioned in their statement what they are doing and why they are doing that. So the ordinary villagers, like innocent children and women, have nothing to do with what Burmese government is claiming, that everyone is misframed as a terrorists. This is absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, Anaga, is that what's happening? This sort of collective punishment, as we see an insurgency on the one hand, and then you have the Rohingya people who, through an accident of history, happen to be in a place where they're not wanted, so they're being blamed for everything?
Well, I mean, it's certainly true that this group appears to have expanded. It's become stronger. And, you know, there are reports that might be credible that this group, members of this group, I want to be clear, not ordinary Rohingya people and people in Rohingya communities, have attacked non-Muslim, at least one non-Muslim village, leading to the death of some people. Now, I find it very hard to believe that this group, this militant group, would be seen by ordinary Rohingyas as a legitimate representative of their cause, because it's very clear, and it should have been clear to the leaders of this group, based on their experience and what followed their attacks last October, that any action like this is going to harm the Rohingya cause more than it's going to help it.
Yeah, let's have a little listen to the UN Human Rights Chief, who had some very strong words about what's been going on.
Decades of persistent and systematic human rights violations, including the very violent security responses to the attacks since October 2016, have almost certainly contributed to the nurturing of violent extremism, with everyone ultimately losing.
So, Hla Kyo, you have the UN Human Rights Chief using the word systematic. I think that's quite important, and a lot of culpability then, the blame going towards the government there. You have, in the past, the Rohingya people said nobody cares about us. You've had the Turkish president and others speak out about it, a UN Security Council meeting. Are you seeing now greater international awareness for your cause?
Actually, we are quite disappointed. It is quite disappointing that international community is not doing anything effective to stop Burmese atrocity crimes against Rohingya villagers, especially children and women. And also, this is actually, of course, it is long-standing, systematic, state-directed, state-sponsored persecution of the Rohingya people. This is one of the largest the Burmese crimes against the Rohingya people. In 1978, they expelled the more than 270,000 people. In 1991 and 92, and in 2012 until 2015, and last year in 2016 October, and now this is systematic and long-standing standing state-sponsored persecution against the Rohingya people. Yes. We are not seeing anything effective by the international community. Yes.
Yeah, what do you want to be done? Do you want the Rohingya people to be given citizenship? How do you see this moving forward? What can be done by outside forces to pressure the government, and what can that government then do to make you happy?
Yes, right now the emergency, it is emergency situation. It is international emergency situation actually. So what we want is United Nations Security Council mobilize United Nations peacekeeping forces there, and to create under the United Nations a safe zone. So, and then and then humanitarian aids and international media are allowed to go there to investigate what is going on there. And also, we want the Burmese government to immediately stop the mass atrocity against the Rohingya people. And finally, we want to get the rights what we got after independence 1948. We were legitimate, recognized ethnic Rohingya ethnic and citizenship of the Myanmar until 1962. So we want the same right as we had before, like any other ethnic groups in Myanmar. This is what we want. And also we want Kofi Annan Commission recommendation to be implemented as soon as possible, immediately.
Anaga, what does it mean to you when you see those images coming from places like Yangon and hundreds of people take to the streets in support of the state's approach to the Rohingya, and they chant nationalist slogans with a lot of Buddhist nationalism attached to it, and they call for the government to be tougher on the Rohingya. Tell me what that means.
Well, I mean, as you know, I'm sure, this is an incredibly polarizing, divisive issue in Myanmar society. It's probably safe to say that the vast majority of people in Myanmar, and the politicians also, are not really sympathetic to the Rohingya, I won't say cause, but the plight of the Rohingya people. So what's happening in Rakhine is driven by local dynamics, but it is happening in a broader context in Myanmar, where there's the rise, as you mentioned, of Buddhist nationalism and also a certain anti-Muslim feeling across the country. And the real danger is, of course, if you start to, as Lacho was suggesting, if you start to sort of see all Rohingya as the same as members of this group, it becomes a very different framing of the problem. It doesn't become about Rohingya communities believing they have a legitimate right to be citizens of Myanmar and to be able to move around freely and access services. It becomes about tarring a whole community with a brush of being a jihadist or terrorist, which is clearly not going to help anything in the long run. It's certainly not going to help the government deal with the situation in Rakhine.
And then, Anaga, when these thousands of people go to Bangladesh and they cross the border in desperation, the Bangladeshis are not too keen to have them. What's behind that dynamic?
I think countries have a hard time accepting large inflows of people. Bangladesh is hardly unique in this. There's a very complex regional dynamic, obviously, and Bangladesh has its own domestic issues. I think while it's important to know what Bangladesh can do with these very large numbers and for these very large numbers of Rohingya, the real issue and the solution to the issue lies in Myanmar to start with.
Lakyo, there's been a lot of talk about the Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi and how she's almost tarnished her moral standing, her moral reputation, and let down the people of Rakhine State, especially the Rohingya. Has she let you down personally?
Of course, we have been supporting her while she was in home arrest, and we have been protesting for her release. So now she is collaborating with what the army is doing, atrocity crimes against the Rohingya people. And on top of that, a state consular information Facebook page is spreading propaganda news, and also inflammatory rhetoric, which is believed by the people around in whole Myanmar. This is very, very dangerous, and also, and she herself is Islamophobes. So she is really become the shield for the international community to go and do any intervention there.
Anaga, has she tarnished her reputation? And is she an Islamophobe, as La calls her?
What the government of Myanmar does and what the State Councillor's office chooses to do.
This is on the record.
Sure. Go ahead, Anaga.
Sure. I mean, I think we need to see what happens in the coming weeks. Obviously, I think internationally it's expressed quite widely a real sense of disappointment in Aung San Suu Kyi. But that is in its place. What we need to see now is what the government of Myanmar does in the next few weeks. That its actions are how it should be judged in the weeks to come.
Anaga, what do you think they'll do, given the international condemnation, given that there is some pressure on them now? And I guess, you know, the Rohingya will feel that nobody really cares about their cause, but we're seeing more and more people talk about it now. So how do you think they will respond?
I mean, I suspect they know very well how very, very serious this is for them politically, diplomatically. So both domestically as well, there's a huge impetus to make sure this doesn't spill over. And internationally, I'm sure there is an awareness that this is not being viewed in any favorable light. I would imagine in a best case scenario, what would happen is that the military response is proportionate and doesn't target civilians. That in a really best case scenario, that humanitarian agencies and media have unfettered access to all parts of Rakhine, of northern Rakhine anyway, and all communities in Rakhine State. And the third and most important thing is that there is a plan announced for the rollout of the recommendations of the Annan Commission, and that's done quite fast. So those are the sorts of actions that will indicate to us what approach the government is going to take.
Yeah, and
it should be judged on both fronts.
Yeah, the government has really consistently refused visas for a proposed UN fact-finding team. We'll have to wait and see as to whether that changes. Very finally, Hla, there were going to be 3 people on this panel. At the last minute, we lost someone who was I guess, somebody who was pro the Myanmar government. And as my producer was discussing this story with this particular individual, this person said that the Rohingya are not Rohingya, they're just Bengalis. And it's really interesting. Terminology is so, I guess, toxic and important in this. When they just say, you're just Bengalis, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, it is really that means to us as an insult. We have a universal human right to identify ourselves as a Rohingya, as an individual, or as a collective group. We have these human rights, universal human rights, and he is ignorant of the fact, historical fact, that we have been recognized as a ethnic community, as a citizenship of Myanmar with Rohingya. Even in the book of curriculum of Burmese school, the Rohingya they are mentioned there. Rohingya are one of the ethnic community there. So it is he is ignorant of the fact that we belong to the Myanmar as a Rohingya, as an ethnic community, as one of the ethnic communities of Myanmar, as recognized citizen of the Myanmar. Since 1982, citizenship law that stripped our citizenship rights and ethnic rights.
Yeah, well, we sincerely hope for an end to the suffering of the people of the region. It's a terrible situation. Hla Kyo and Anaga Nilakantan, I'm going to have to move on. I thank you both for joining us on the Newsmakers.
Thank you.
Coming up, this book could answer some burning questions about the Iraq war. But will it get past government censors? We speak to the author. And could a population boom not be the ticking time bomb some people make it out to be? It's been 7 years since US President Barack Obama ended his country's combat mission in Iraq, but allegations of abuse remain. Stories of torture against Iraqis, like at Abu Ghraib, are only the beginning, and where they end is anybody's guess. Some people believe a former Defense Department official could hold the answers in his new book. In the book, Unjustifiable Means, Mark Fallon writes in the memoir about what he saw on the front lines fighting al-Qaeda. Up until now, the Pentagon has buried his book under pre-publication review, a process that should take 30 days, but has lasted more than 7 months. Well, joining me now is Mark Fallon, who's in Jacksonville, Florida, and joining me in the studio is retired U.S. Army Brigadier General Mark Kimmett. He was the spokesman for the U.S. military in Iraq under President George W. Bush. Gentlemen, I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on this. Let me begin with Mark Fallon first. I haven't read the book. I don't think I'm allowed to read the book yet. In a nutshell, what's in the book?
Well, the book talks about the failed policies that were enacted post 9/11. We kind of abandoned our values and we adopted some practices that have been to our national security detriment.
And when I finally get my hands on your book, is it going to be all unredacted, or is it going to have black lines through all the most juicy bits?
Well, we've made a decision to publish the book with the redactions in there. The government had the book for 233 days in a process, as you said, that should be 30. And right now we're at a critical junction where we have a president that has actually endorsed the use of waterboarding and other things that would be war crimes. And we're talking about the possible expansion of Guantanamo Bay. So I thought it was important to get my perspective and views out there to hopefully get out in the public debate and help shape national policy in this regard.
So let me then ask you very directly, sir, did the United States systematically conduct torture and cover it up?
Yeah, absolutely. We embrace torture. We enacted a national policy of state-sponsored torture. And that those policies and those tactics spread from the CIA to the Department of Defense, went from Guantanamo on to Abu Ghraib, and created adversaries with people that we were looking to embrace when we invaded those countries.
Mark Emmett, you were in Iraq at the time of Abu Ghraib. You were in the eye of the storm. I mean, they were putting you up there to sort of, defend what seemed to be the indefensible when those pictures came out. Does this sound consistent with what you experienced and what you know from your time working within these administrations?
No, not at all. I think that when you take a look at Abu Ghraib, for instance, we continued to have these inflammatory, unjustified words being used. The fact remains that Abu Ghraib was prisoner abuse. There was absolutely no doubt of that. That prisoner abuse was not conducted by interrogators. It was conducted by a small rogue group of National Guard soldiers that fundamentally had not been supervised by their superior officers in organization. They were fooling around. But to suggest that it was torture, systematic torture, or intentional torture on the part of the U.S. military inside Iraq at that time is absolutely false and inconsistent with everything that I personally saw.
Mark Fallon, prisoner abuse, just a few rotten apples.
No, it's absolutely false. That's the talking points from 2004. And when the book comes out, you'll see what actually happened at Abu Ghraib and how that happened and the results of that.
Okay,
well,
so give us a taste.
I would simply say that having not been there, I'm not sure how Mark would understand that.
Okay.
I was there. I was on the ground. I saw what happened. I looked at every piece of evidence. And to suggest it was absolutely false is clearly the opinion of somebody, not the facts, but the opinion of somebody who was nowhere near that situation at that time.
Okay, Mark Fallon.
Well, actually, I don't want to argue with the general here, but I did have forces in Abu Ghraib, and I had been to Iraq myself, and I do know the facts of the case. I was responsible for investigating al-Qaeda. And so when the book comes out, the public can make their own decision on that, as had the torture report, as had the Senate Armed Service Committee. So the facts are clear.
Right.
It's just some people fail to embrace them.
Yeah, it's interesting, Mark Fallon. Let me ask you, because some who might be familiar with the Senate torture report, as many call it, of December 2014, would say, okay, so what's going to be new in your book? Because that report told us of all sorts of horrible things beyond waterboarding, like, I don't know, rectal hydration and prisoners freezing to death on the cold floor. Mock executions, people buried in coffins and so on for a period of time. So if they read all of that, what's new in your book?
What's new is putting it into context, talking about the insider perspective of how within the Department of Defense, how there was incredible fights to oppose that, how people tried to prevent the torture from happening, and then the results. What the strategic consequence have been, the cost and consequence for our nation.
General Kimmitt, what's so wrong about sort of admitting that maybe this happened? Maybe there were not just maybe rogue elements on the ground amongst, you know, the prison guards and so on. But maybe within the administration at the time, yes, there were those who felt that they needed to go the extra mile to extract this information from Al-Qaeda suspects and so on. What's so wrong about saying maybe we made mistakes?
No, nobody's suggesting for a moment that mistakes were made inside of Abu Ghraib and inside most of these situations. However, they were mistakes not of ill intent, not conspiratorial. I mean, people draw their own opinions and they sell these opinions as facts. They were nowhere near the facts. But I think you bring up a very good point. As we retrospectively look at this situation, we see it through a completely different set of glasses than those that saw it either in the wake of 9/11 or actually saw it happen on the ground.
That sounds like a justification, doesn't it?
I'm not suggesting it's a justification. What it is, it's an explanation.
Is that a credible explanation, Mark Fallon?
Well, it is an explanation, but I hear a lot of excuses here. It was clearly state-sponsored torture. It was approved at the highest levels. There was legal manipulation. There was medical manipulation. The CIA started this program with the RDI program, and that spread to the Department of Defense. And we continue to live with the results today.
And Mark Fallon, and because you're two Marks, I have to keep on saying both your last names. Mark Fallon, when we look at the definitions here, right, there are those who say enhanced interrogation techniques. This is not torture. Something like waterboarding is an enhanced interrogation technique. It's not torture. That's what the president even says. What exactly are we talking about? When you say torture, generally, what image do you want to give the viewers? Are you merely giving them the image of something like waterboarding, which some would call enhanced interrogation techniques, or are you talking about more than that? Because I think that's crucial.
Yeah, the EIT program wasn't enhanced interrogation techniques at all. It was actually adopted from the way that the North Koreans treated our prisoners, and the EIT program was an excuse to inflict torture. So the image of, and let's not make this antiseptic waterboarding. Our service members were waterboarded, at least the Navy portions were. They stopped that because it was an abysmal failure. But they were given 8 ounces of water for 20 seconds, not over 80 applications of water and gallons after you've been beaten, thrown against walls, slapped, abused, kept naked, put in coffins. So the abuses that occurred are just atrocious. And even though some photos from Abu Ghraib have been released, there are many, many more that are locked away in safes that the U.S. government never wants to see the light of day.
Mohammed, is that true?
I am not aware of any photos from Abu Ghraib that haven't been released. Look, and again, let me stipulate, what was done at Abu Ghraib to those prisoners was absolute prisoner abuse. It was not done for the purpose of extracting intelligence out of those prisoners. It was, as you would say, properly, a couple of bad apples. It was a large number of bad apples that frankly were bored. They were having a good time. The ringleader was a former U.S. prison guard. So I think that you might understand that they were just trying to take some, what we call glory photos. They were wrong, they were prosecuted, but to try to link what those soldiers were doing on the ground to any program to extract intelligence information for the purposes of protecting our country is just incorrect.
If those photographs had not been released, had not been leaked, if 60 Minutes had not done that program, would it have been policy to keep it in-house?
Keep what in-house?
The
story of Abu Ghraib?
Yes.
The story of Abu Ghraib, it's very important to understand that within 24 hours of General Sanchez seeing those photos, it was announced on international television that there was an investigation going on at Abu Ghraib. That was in January of 2004. The photos, by contrast, didn't come, I think it was March or April when they came out. There was absolutely no attempt to hide this information or suppress this information. It's just a fact.
Mark Fallon, what Mark Kimmett is saying suggests transparency and wanting to weed out the bad apples. Your book says otherwise. Tell me why.
Actually, the facts state otherwise. The Taguba report says otherwise. The Central Armed Services Committee says otherwise. General Miller came over to Abu Ghraib from Guantanamo Bay and brought the cancerous torture techniques with him. So frankly, the facts don't support what the general is telling you today.
Well, but let me be very clear. I know that 24 hours after those pictures were shown to General Sanchez, it was announced because, number one, I was with General Sanchez when those pictures were shown, and number two, I was the one that made the announcement within 24 hours. So if that's what it says in the book, that's certainly not what my good friend General Taguba said in his investigation. I talked to him about this. Now, again, I understand what the purpose of trying to get the questions and the correct evaluation of these programs and what it has done to our programs in foreign countries and what it has done in terms of the perception of Americans. I'm not trying to, again, hide from that fact. In many ways, this was a stain on the military, it was a stain on the government, and a stain on our national character. I admit that, but we've got to do that rationally. We can't try to make these arguments based on opinions. We've got to use facts. And if somebody is trying, as the old saying goes, they're entitled to their opinions. They're not entitled to their facts.
Mark Fallon, to those who will read your book and say, yes, maybe you're right, and maybe we had to bend the rules sometimes, but we had to bend the rules to keep America safe and to wipe out terrorists, what would you say to them?
Well, the torture program was an abysmal failure. The general is absolutely wrong. There was no linkage to the bin Laden raid to torture techniques whatsoever. This has all been in the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence report. These are the facts of the case. I was responsible for investigating al-Qaeda at the time for trials for a military commission. I was responsible for giving President Bush reasons to believe to determine who to try before military commissions. I do know the facts, and I can tell you, torture produced no useful information that we didn't already have. All it did was embolden our adversaries and made terrorists unprosecutable. And we're struggling at Guantanamo today because of those policies.
And do you believe the CIA, the Pentagon, and all other arms of government are in denial about this?
Oh, no, not at all. I think those who are the torture advocates, the torture lobby, still embraces those 2002 to 2004 talking points. They continue to use the perception management campaign established that these things were safe, necessary, and effective. They were none of those things. They were not created by professional interrogators. They were not created by investigators. We knew how to interrogate al-Qaeda. We had done it for years. We had done it in the investigation of the USS Cole. We had done it during the first attacks on the World Trade Center. We had processes and we had policies in place. The programs that were enacted by psychologists who had no experience in interrogation, had no experience in the Middle East, and frankly didn't know what they were doing. They were the modern day equivalent of snake oil salesmen, and we bought it hook, line, and sinker.
Okay, I wish we had more time. We do not, but I think it's been important that we had this discussion and we had both sides on it. Mark Fallon and Mark Kimmett, it's been a pleasure having both of you on the program.
I'll never let this flag go. My name is Ivan Mawarire. A lot of people know me as Pastor E or Pastor Ivan because I'm a pastor for a church, and I've been pastoring a lot of young people for a lot of years. Well, when I decided to speak out, the intention definitely wasn't to enter politics. It was pure frustration. And this happened in April of 2016.
This flag, every day that it flies, is begging for you to get involved, is begging for you to say something, is begging for you to cry out.
Nothing could have prepared me for the kind of life I live now. Whenever I leave home every day with the prospect that I could end up in prison for a couple of days, because that is what has happened to me in the last couple of months.
I escaped Zimbabwe. soon after my release because my wife and my children, they had been threatened.
When I came back after I'd been arrested and then got released, I decided I was not going to leave my flag. Every symbol, every color, whatever it stands for, has been violated. So for example, the green stands for our agricultural backbone and our agricultural strength. We haven't produced any food on our own farms in the last 25 years in Zimbabwe. The yellow stands for the minerals in the ground. Zimbabwe is one of the richest countries when it comes to natural resources, but we're poor. The resources are abused. The red stands for the blood that was shed by those that went to the liberation struggle. And our question has always been, if this is what they fought for, then they paid for nothing with their lives. The black stands for the black majority who are supposed to be prosperous in Zimbabwe, but it's the black majority who are suffering in Zimbabwe. And so when I pray for God to look after me and look after my family, it makes sense for me to also pray that God would help us with our governance, with the corruption, with the disease, with the crime, with the unemployment. We are at a crossing point in Zimbabwe, whether we like it or not, and it's an inescapable crossing point. We're coming from one generation of leadership to the next generation of leadership. Even if you put us in jail, no matter what it is, and when we come out, if it's not fixed, we're gonna go back for it again.
If you think the world is a crowded place now, try adding another 3 billion people on it. Well, that's going to happen in the next few decades, according to the Population Reference Bureau. Some believe the rising number of people on Earth is a ticking time bomb. As the population grows and resources decrease, they say a cataclysmic war is inevitable. But before you start building your underground bunker, there are scientists out there who disagree with that grim assessment.
It's one of the defining issues of our time. Global population growth that's pushing the planet to its limits. A new report says the world's population will swell to nearly 10 billion people by 2050. That's an annual increase of more than 80 million people for the next 33 years. The majority of the growth is in Africa, where the population is expected to double in size, accounting for more than half of the global increase by 2050. Niger leads the continent's growth. Its population is projected to triple in size. The country is also among the leading sources of African migrants arriving in Europe.
We are just going to find something to do as a young man.
India will register the largest population increase, more than 300 million people, putting it on track to surpass China to become the world's most populous nation. China and Japan will see their populations plummet, presenting them both with a looming demographic crisis. Experts say the world is in the midst of a demographic transition. Net global fertility rates are going down, and as more nations become more developed, global population growth will inevitably decline. But predictions on when that drop-off will come are inconsistent at best. Deutsche Bank says the world's population will peak in 2055 at 8.7 billion people, and will decline to 8 billion by 2100. But the UN believes the world's population will reach as high as 12 billion by 2100. Meanwhile, the increasing number of people in the world is already putting unprecedented pressure on a natural environment. In some places, everything from water to food to energy resources are already scarce. As populations shift sharply, it's difficult to predict how prepared the most affected countries will be. And for many nations, the challenges are only expected to get worse as the effects of climate change become more severe, raising the question of how ready the world is for a potentially very crowded future. Basil Rehan, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Peter Goldstein. He's the Population Reference Bureau's Vice President of Communication and Marketing. Peter, good to have you on the program. And there's a limited amount of stuff around on this finite planet, only so much to go around. Are we going to be in deep trouble as we tear each other apart and scramble for those limited resources the bigger the population becomes?
Well, clearly, I think to a certain extent, you're already seeing that happening. For example, in Africa and some other developing regions, you've seen, for example, Europe grappling with a very large migration issue. And I think to a large extent that can be driven by the fact that you have more people chasing a really declining level of resources in their country. I've heard predictions, I've heard estimates saying that we are actually using the level of natural resources in the world about 1.7 times faster than the world is actually able to replenish them. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but clearly in certain regions of the world you are seeing very pronounced environmental pressures. For example, in the Sahel region in Africa, particularly in the context of the impact of climate change, people are certainly feeling the pressures of declining amounts of water, declining fertility of land, et cetera, which is really generating a lot of pressures for people to migrate into other areas and can create pressures for social and political conflict as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so that's the developing world where we're seeing booming populations which are, adding stress to already fragile systems. Now, with the developed countries, we're seeing some countries slipping below replacement rate, like Japan, for example. Isn't there a paradox here? Because you have these developed countries now who, I guess, are well aware that globally we're going to run out of resources and this is bad for the world. But they're looking at their declining populations and they're going, it's bad for the economy. We don't have workers. We have too many old people on Social Security and so on. So now they're encouraging their people to make more babies and they're encouraging immigration. How do you square this paradox? Because now you're having developing countries that developed countries that hit a particular point and then they go, hey, we need more babies again. Isn't that bad?
That's true. They're facing a completely opposite problem. And as you mentioned, in a lot of developed countries, in fact, they've reached a point where their demographic trajectory is going to become almost stagnant, if not negative. For example, in Romania, our projection is that their population may decline by as much as a third by 2050. This poses very serious issues, as you mentioned, in terms of sustaining their economic growth. The truth is that in most countries, once a birth rate goes down, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to get it to go back up again. So effectively, if they want to have growing populations, they are going to have to accept greater immigration. There really is no other mathematical way, if you will, to make that happen. And this is creating a lot of pressure on obviously on their fiscal situations. We see that in the United States currently, where the projections are for a much larger increase in the older age population. That raises questions about how they're going to be supported and the fact that fewer of them will be working, which does have implications for the economy as well.
My mind is always blown when I look at history and I find that not too long ago, just a few generations ago, our global population was less than 1 billion even. I want to ask you, given all the projections you have about where we're going, looking at where we are now at about 7.5 billion, is there an optimum global population where we're in this kind of Goldilocks sweet spot and everything is sort of okay?
That's a very hard question to answer. Obviously, there's a lot of factors that weigh in. For example, technological innovations, energy innovations. How are we going to grapple with the climate change challenge that's facing the entire world right now? So I would say that it's very difficult to point to a particular figure. What I can say is that if we can slow down the pace of population growth, that gives us more time to think about how to adapt to higher population levels.
And how do we adapt to higher population levels? What are the kind of policy recommendations?
Well, that's another good question. I mean, I think a lot of countries are grappling with this question right now. For example, how do we adapt to less intensive resource use, for example. And I think there's a lot of organizations, a lot of governments, a lot of companies who are investing quite a bit of money right now trying to come up with ways to do so. You know, for example, I just saw an article recently here in the US where energy companies are investing in algae as an energy source, as a clean energy source. So for example, is there a way for us to transition to sources of energy, sources of food, sources of shelter, et cetera, that are more sustainable and more economical and efficient? And that's really, in a way, the best way to try to adapt. I think there's also a big political challenge as well, which is, can we muster the diplomatic and political skills such that we're able to grapple with the stark migration challenges that are going to be faced? Will we be able to ensure that in countries where you do have these greater pressures, that we can help them to develop in such a way that those pressures recede as well?
Peter Goldstein, good to talk to you. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.